Welcome everybody to, I just want to say, hey, welcome everybody to our May anti-racism program, Placemaking and Place-Based Commemorations. Huge thank you to the New York State Archives and the New York State Library for funding this work. Huge thank you to DHPSNY for facilitating all of this so that we can be here together. And also a big thank you to my co-facilitators, Justin and Ramin, who you'll meet in a little bit. Today's program is about building an inclusive 250th. This is our theme for 2024. And our guiding question is, how do we make our collecting organizations interdisciplinary and representative of the realities of our many New York histories? Really hoping to bring an anti-racist lens to our work around the 250th. We created these norms together in 2022, and we still use them. If you'd like to add anything or shift anything, please let us know in the chat. We lead with love. We understand that this is a journey. We drop the mic, step up, step back. So if you're typically quiet, we invite you to step up to the mic. If you like to share, we invite you after you share to step back and create some space for other folks. We ask you to speak for yourself and your own experiences, to embody the values of inclusion and respect and mutual positive regard. We ask you to use direct communication that's clear and impeccable when you're able to. We ask you to come to the space teachable and open your mind. We ask you to really listen, stay engaged, even when the topic or conversation is difficult. We ask you to speak your own truth, experience and step into discomfort, expect and accept non-closure. Nobody's going to solve anti-racism in the 2 hours we have together today, but we do the work so that eventually we can. And so we accept that there's non-closure to these conversations. You can ask questions in the chat. You can put it in the anonymous question catcher. You can raise your hand and we'll call on you either physically, or you can use your raise hand button. We want you to be responsible for what you say and hear in this space. And by that, we want you to take the lessons and share them, but keep the stories private. Use I statements. Assume best intent on the part of your other attendees. And most importantly, we want you to love each other into education. At the end of today's facilitated dialogue, we want you to have considered your organization's collections, exhibits, programs, and institutional planning from a hyper-local perspective, including stories from your city, village, town, hamlet, and/or county, alongside the perspectives of contemporary and 21st century Indigenous communities. So we want you to fold in everything that we are learning together to really broaden perspective around these things. We're going to do some introductions. Like Leah said, we have a teach-in that is recorded. And then we stop the recording after the teach-in, which is like a mini webinar. We have a dialogue between the co-facilitators. We do some small group conversations, come back together as a large group, open it up to questions for you, and then we talk through some next steps and action items. So today's structure, like I said, large and small group conversations. We're going to build community, share information, discuss, debrief, and make plans for the future. We'll hear from practitioners in the field in their experiences with bringing 21st century Indigenous perspective into how we understand our hyper-local pursuits around the 250th. You can expect to feel uncomfortable, curious, frustrated, heard, confused, and surprised. And with that, I am going to ask Justin to introduce himself, and then Justin, I'll ask you to pass it to Ramin.
I always appreciate when we get to use that picture, because that's my son Oliver, and it was like he's my first checkout. I've been in my position as the Akwesasne Cultural Center Director for 2 years now. I'm Wolf Clan. I'm from Akwesasne Mohawk Nation. We reside on the U.S. portion currently, so that would be the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. And yeah, at the Culture Center, we have our library that's on the first floor, and on the bottom floor, we have our museum and our gallery. And thank you for inviting me here to, and I'll try to do my best to help.
Should I go?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Oh,
Jesse.
sorry.
Go ahead, Ramin. Yeah.
um, my name is Ramin Ganeshram. I'm the executive director of the Westport Museum for History and Culture in Westport, Connecticut, that rests on the unceded lands of the Paugussett tribe here in Connecticut. I am a historian of the African American and mixed race experience in the colonial and early federal period, with a focus on very specifically culinary history and how it is an access point to larger historical themes.
Thank you both. And folks who have been to our programs before will recognize both Justin and Ramin because we have co-facilitated together. Real quick, we're gonna have this facilitated conversation. It's what we call our teach-in. This portion of the program gives us a foundation for the upcoming conversation that's not recorded. We're going to spend some time talking about the importance of perspective when considering place-based commemorations, and we're going to share strategies for centering Indigenous perspectives in our placemaking. And so just want to make sure everybody knows that this part is, you can feel free to ask questions. We probably won't like call on you to have you voice them during the recorded part, but we'll definitely call on you afterwards. So this this is going to give us the foundation for all of us to have a meaningful conversation. So it's like a little teaching, a little conversation. All right, we ready? Okay. We're not going to share slides while we do that. So the place I sort of want to start is I want to know what's the basic stuff we need to know, Ramin and Justin. When we were planning this, we had talked a lot about it, a bunch of different things that kind of give us that foundational knowledge. So I'm just going to open it up. Maybe Ramin, if you want to take that question first, and then we'll toss it over to Justin, and we can keep tossing it back and forth as it makes sense. But really, what's the basic stuff we need to know?
For us, our approach is the basic thing that we always start from is that Indigenous history is incredibly complex and it is not taught in the school system, right? Indigenous history is almost like a little tack on, a little, thumbtack on this larger Eurocentric history. And that sounds like an obvious statement. I think we all agree with that, but it's important to really understand that because when you're making your presentations, when you're trying to do placemaking, you're dealing with a public or a visitor base that is starting from behind zero. So they really don't have any kind of foundational base. Just wants to add to that at all
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I think I'm just really grateful for Ramin to be here because me being in this position for 2 years, I'm working just for a little bit of my background. I spent 40 years just in white schools and then in about 12 years, 12 to 14 years doing administrative training, HR, management, change management, and more of a corporate setting. So I'm coming to this point of view kind of 40 years of learning all the tools I needed for the job, but in the last 2 years, what's been most fulfilling in my life is that now I get to kind of regain part of my ancestry and my cultural heritage that was taken from me because I'm a descendant from my great grandfather who was taken to Carolina University, uh, killed the Indian, saved the man, and then later on, my grandmother was taken for a few years because her speech impediment was she was speaking Mohawk or CCAHA. And we have, those back-to-back, generations of being controlled by the state led to my father, who was born in the community, but then later raised in Syracuse, and my grandma was terrified of losing him. So this is where that disconnect is just reinforced, and it's where I can draw a point from point A to point B, where why I don't speak Kanien'kehá:ka, why I don't know too much about my own. I don't have my heritage with me. So the last 2 years has been nice at the Culture Center to even start reclaiming what should have been, you know, given to me at birth. So for me, it's also I'm trying to be a template for my community to help others in the same process I'm in. And that's why I think the Culture Center has a lot of great work to do at the library, in the museum, and also just outreaching, just because so much of our history is not in schools. Again, I went to school, and yeah, there's like high school pages of like high school history books is like maybe a page or two, and that's it. And then no explanation where our community has gone. And so it's really interesting to start from that point of view of like, yeah, there really isn't any indigenous history in New York State, and I'm a product of the New York State education system. And the only localized injection was that our community really fought to have some Mohawk teachers come in and do some like small half an hour classes here and there in my education. So, and that's something we had to fight for, and that would be localized just to Salmon River and maybe Messina. So that isn't anything that's given to the entire state. So that is, that's where, at least where I'm coming from too, is like there's a lot more. Yeah, I think we could do it that way, even just pick a point. But yeah.
I think, can I just add something to that? Because Justin made me think about something that I think is so important, and it's that whatever limited Native history, Indigenous history is taught is taught as a past tense, right? And I think that as a society, we have been inculcated to thinking about it as a past tense. In other words, that the tribal people of the Americas are not present with us today. And I think when we think about placemaking and we think about this work, we must consider these communities as present with us today, no matter how dwindled the numbers are, because it's a very different approach when you're talking about groups of people who are currently in the cultural landscape and can and should be engaged and can and are affected by whatever approaches you choose in your institutions. So that takes a little work, right? Psychologically, to stop thinking the way we've always been taught, that these people were here and they're not now. Very often that is not the case.
Yeah, that is a great point, because if I pass because I'm half, I very pass as white, and growing up I would always hear like what really people felt about our community, and it was always, if they knew about it, was always in with the broadest of like cultural strokes from cowboys, Indians, or just like the local um racist remarks of like smugglers, or just everything that was just very negative. I've never heard anyone just casually saying anything positive about our community. If they knew our community existed, I would go to programs just in the North Country, half an hour away, and people would be surprised that they actually had a tribal community within like an hour driving distance. So it's like, growing up, I was aware of like how even though we are here centralized in like the central part of northern New York, still even communities half an hour away, 45 minutes away, had very little interest or even knowledge about our community. I mean, our closest community to us is Messina, and then we fought for decades to get them to change the Red Raider mascot. So it's like, it just shows you what kind of partnership we've had with our local neighbors. But yes, the fact that we're still here is one of the things I remember hearing in the mid-teens. And I just feel like every year that passes, it means more to me, and it makes more sense now, because like I do come across these spaces and I see that like there's very shocking to people that we still exist, and and I feel like our community, and I can say this for other communities, we're thriving. And to hear that we're doing that is another shock to them. So having the ability to be like, yes, we're still here, is is not just a small statement. I think it means more every year that passes. And culturally in the zeitgeist, the last couple of years we've had a moment, reservation dogs, Lily Gladstone being in certain prominent movies. So it's showing people that not only are we still here, but we're definitely entering the conversation. So that is something I feel like is changing currently. But yeah, for the last 10 years, like we're still here was carried a lot, and that's not really great if like your slogan is we're still here, just to kind of have people enter the conversation that way.
Yeah, thank you both for that. So placemaking and place-based commemorations, as you both have sort of alluded to, are a matter of perspective. Whose perspective are you going to use when you're doing this commemoration and when you're thinking about how to honor the space you're in and make it a relevant space? Um, what what do we need to think about in terms of those perspectives and whose perspectives we're centering? I know you both had sort of complementary ideas on how we understand this. Um, I think, Ramin, why don't you take this one first and then we'll toss it over to Justin.
Um, so kind of to follow on what we were saying, the documentary record that we have that we work from, in order to try to do this work with as much rigor as possible, is of course Eurocentric, right? The written record is Eurocentric. So obviously we have to understand that from the beginning. That's where it's coming from. But there, for me, I think what we need to really, I think that's a statement. But I think that we need to really understand what that means, right? It's not simply the experience of people of European descent versus native tribal people. Let's really kind of break it down. I'm a journalist by training, so we always say follow the money, right? So what it really is the experience of people who came here for largely commercial purposes, and had a very specific goal in mind. And I'm saying that we all know this, right? I'm saying that because the intention to which we come into a relationship is going to guide and color that relationship, right? So while we all are told that kind of pretty story about religious freedom, and that is a piece of the story, that's not the overwhelming story. What I say is that we really need to understand the transactional nature of Europeans on Indigenous, tribal land, as a starting point, because when you look at it from that perspective, I feel that we can get into more clearly the tenor of what is said, the goal of certain documentary records, right? They have a kind of almost a PR goal, for all who are reading it, to make a case for doing certain things, right? Against tribal communities. And, what I would say is we need to think about it like this. In our everyday life, if we are talking about, yes, I had an interaction with my boss, with the person I'm about to do a business deal with, versus my loved one, versus my relative, we all understand that those are different relationships guided with different intents. And so the documentary evidence we will leave behind from these two relationships, or these various relationships, will differ greatly. All things are not equal, right? So we want to be objective, but we also need to understand that all things are not equal. So that's kind of what I would say as a first point.
Awesome. Justin, I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about what do we need to think about in terms of whose perspective we're centering? I know when we were planning for this, we talked about when local history quote like begins.
Yeah, I it's one of those things I started doing again. It just being in this job for 2 years now, and I started looking around like when I'm taking my son to like hockey or lacrosse games, or just going about on my own, and then going into coffee shops in Canton and seeing they have the history of Canton starting at 18 something. I go to Saranac, and at the Hotel Saranac, they'll have a big, beautiful presentation, gorgeous, with like all these cool facts. The founding of Saranac, 1800s. It's like there's nothing that goes any prior to that, and there's like again such a beautiful history waiting to be told there. And I'm just not picking on just Canton and Saranac, but it this is the ongoing pattern in every community that you're just going to see a stoppage there, and it's it's really kind of interesting. What's perspective too is that I know I'm tipping a little bit into um, Ramin's point later about ignorance, but I just love it. It's such a good way to help me even because I'll be giving a tour down in the museum during the summer, and I'll have people just bring up, oh, warring noble savages. I'm like, well, we're a little bit more complicated than that. And I always take the approach that if they're going to be at our museum, they're going to come all the way to our community. They're going to be open. And so I start working back those very broad and very stereotypical Hollywood notions and start bringing it back to reality of like, no, we were very complex communities that lived with other communities that, again, you drop back further, lived with very diverse, different communities. And I say, I'm like, it would, so I start teaching from that point of view. And I know I have an audience that will be willing and listen and hopefully change. And then there's other points where I'll be in a meeting, and this happened last summer where we were meeting with a vendor and they couldn't have, it was just so in the moment. I had a moment with my staff where we all looked at each other when they said, oh, well, you guys know you have that, like, you're born with that little magical instinct to kind of see beyond what's there and like kind of see ghosts. And I'm like, afterwards, after they left, we all kind of looked at each other and be like, you just heard that, right? and and that is something else I've come across in my life is like, I wish we were magical beings, but we're not. It's really interesting to see what level of ignorance is coming in, just because then we can hopefully start working with them. And but at certain points is like you can only try to interject where you can. And so I guess where it is, it's like where are we starting with the people I'm communicating with? And if I get an email about helping participate a parade for the upcoming 250th, I kind of need to start off with like almost like a questionnaire, be like, okay, what do you know about us? Or what do you know about Indigenous people in general in the United States? Like, you know, sometimes we have to roll back. Again, we're not a monolith. If we have to start there, then we have to start there. Is that there's hundreds and thousands of unique individual nations that make up, on Onoago or Turtle Island. And even in them, in the last 400 years, some have gone extinct because of genocide and just the inability to survive where they were shoved to when like a lot of communities were pushed out west. So it's just it's finding out where to start is a big part of it, and then building from there.
Yeah, so that makes me kind of want to go into the conversation of how do we dismantle our Eurocentric perspective? How do we center the Indigenous perspective? And so I think, Ian, if you can talk a little about dismantling the Eurocentric perspective, and just can talk about ways we can center Indigenous perspectives. I think through like have more like complex understanding of Indigenous communities.
So,
Ramin, do you mind going
no,
first?
not
A
at
little
all.
bit about dismantling Eurocentric perspective.
Yeah, not at all. I think, the way that we tend to think about it in my institution, and I think is a way that it can be thought of, is when you want to learn about a subject or a place or a people, something you don't know anything about, you're going to look for the authority, right? You're going to look for the person who knows the most, preferably, somebody from that community, right? You're not going to go to a Greek fishing village and, find the other American and ask them to explain the Greek fishing village to you, you hopefully have a native person there to explain it to you, to take you around, to show you. So I'm using this example to say that when we look at the documentary evidence, period accounts, primary sources written by Europeans about the land, about the people, about the many, many communities, what we are doing is agreeing to let the non-expert explain this place, Turtle Island, to us, right? And why would we do that? Why would we automatically accept as truth the perspective of somebody who is truly ignorant in the purest sense of the word, without knowledge of a place, right? So in dismantling this Eurocentric perspective, the first thing to me is to understand that the primary source material is written by people who are not the experts in any way about what they're seeing. They're giving us a perspective that is completely filtered through their own cultural knowledge. We all do this today. We do it in every aspect of our lives, going from one town to another in our own country, going from one country to another. It's normal. It's human behavior. And they were trying to make sense of the world, not only through their own individual European perspectives, but back to the thing I said first, which was their commercial enterprise, right? They were there for a very, very distinct purpose. And they were trying to make sense of the world and order it into that purpose, which was imperialism, built on the engine of genocide and enslavement, right? So first of all, they're coming to it without knowledge. They're coming to it with an extreme bias. So therefore, to me, when we read this material, not only do we need to know that, I think that what we need to do is to actively remove all the qualifiers from their statements. So I'll give you an example. Right now, I'm completing a book that's based about Caribbean food heritage and its influences on what became sort of American food. And of course, a lot of it has to do with our native Carib and Arawak Taino people, right? And the only way I have found to read this material and draw from it whatever is informational is to very deliberately remove qualifiers, adjectives, to skip over their opinions on how people looked, on what they wore, basically kind of block out the opinion as much as possible and look at the lists of indigenous plants and animals and, the catalog of native words, right? So it takes a little bit of effort to basically mitigate the ignorance, both unintentional and then later, malicious, in describing a place and people that they literally had no authority to describe. So Justin, I don't know if you want to.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to wrote down a couple things because talking about when you're reaching out to our community too. I mean, there's a couple things I thought of right away, just to not caution, but to talking about experts. And a lot of our communities are kind of still recovering from you know hundreds of years of forced assimilation, and like our story, even our community, is like talking about like Ray Fadden and his now grandson runs the Iroquois Museum in Oneonta, and like it's people like him that help kind of restart our own knowledge in our own community back in like the over 80 years ago. And so it's like, and we have specific experts. So when people reach out to me, I'm always trying to plug them into, like, if it's a language, we have experts there, and if it's like historians, we have a couple that can do broad strokes. But like there's so much of our own history too that still is under our feet, literally, because like when I was in high school, there was an opportunity uh I mean, not an opportunity, but we didn't know how certain of our own Mohawk pots were created. And in Quebec, next to Montreal, there was a dig site that found this village that really pristine, intact. And in that they were able to get pieces out and not full on pots, and we were able to rediscover our ability to create our own vessels that we used to use all the time. And so there's so much into, when talking to us about being the authority, is that sometimes we even have a chip on our shoulder saying like we lost so much, but then what we're trying to recover is in that process too. But when it comes to getting that information, is at the same time we're working on passed down history from grandfather, the son, or grandmother down to grandson. And we're trying to also work that in with what we have available in like the textbooks. And again, that's where it's so viable to like that we don't, we know it's coming from a Eurocentric point of view, but those stories will help us also kind of fill the gaps of like the stories we have. So it's such a very interesting thing. I know like a couple of our community members do that work on trying to, again, cultivate as many oral history stories they can to really overlay that with people who were there at the event, and that usually is someone from European descent. And then we try to do our best to see like, well, what also matches how the great law works, how our people would react to a situation like that. And so even for ourselves right now, we're doing a lot of work where we're trying to kind of really repurpose like all that history and to be like, what even for us right now, we're still kind of discovering the what we feel is the right path to that. And so that's still kind of new to us because in a perspective, again, it really, even for our community, and I don't know about other communities, but it wasn't until like 1980s where we were able to start really doing great works of like cultural restoration, being able to celebrate our culture, having our longhouse, being able to practice out in the open. Because in our community from like the 1910s and 1930s, we have stories of the state coming in and burning down the longhouses to um, stop us practicing and using our traditional ways. So in the timeline of things, we're still in this moment of like cultural restoration, cultural like celebration, and right now there's a lot of good work going on. But yeah, when it comes to that, getting that perspective, we're digging into it currently right now to like give a better perspective on like what we feel probably happened. Because again, we weren't there, so you can always we know there's only limitations to that.
Yeah, Justin, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more. Thanks for all of that. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about like what actually are some of the perspectives that we can
Hmm.
start to like
Sorry.
learn more about and start to center. So like once we've done this like sort of decentering of like European views and ideas of Indigenous land and Indigenous people, and we've done the things that you just talked about. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about like fluid borders, cultural exchange. Um, you've given this example of like the Haudenosaunee like good mind and what that means like in terms of sort of intertribal nation relationships across the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So I was just hoping you could talk a little bit about those things.
Yeah, and the Haudenosaunee to start is people of the Longhouse, and that is originally was the Five Nations. We were keepers of the Eastern Door as Mohawks, or as we say, Ganighaga, and we would be more closer to like eastern part of New York State. And then we would have like communities surrounding us, like the Abenaki, Algonquin. I mean, and again, going back to rigid straight lines, even the maps you see that kind of depict the how the Five Nations sit in New York State, and they give us lines, which is always kind of interesting because those are not bad, but what they should really be, they really shouldn't be those rigid lines that just show you a blob where we go from Quebec down to Manhattan. It should be more like these light variations that spread even across from like, say, maybe even Burlington's, we would have a tendril all the way to like Wisconsin, because we do have communities that reached out that far and far as Quebec. And so, but would we predominantly be in those out outreach areas? No, but we would still be there because our communities, even if they weren't part of the Haudenosaunee, like Abenaki or just Algonquin, if you're coming across and relocating your village because you exhausted the natural resources in the area you're coming from, and then you would do this every generation. You would see if there was a community there, then you would just make notice of it, probably talk a little bit to see where's the best place to go. We were going to settle here, but will settle somewhere else, and those communities would talk and help them find a place to settle, because that settling meant that you were for the next 20, 30 years, you'd probably be there for for a while, at least a generation. And even within the Five Nations, those are agreements that early on we would say, well, not to get too much into it, but with the joining, but you'd have like communities of Oneidas, and maybe sandwich in between communities of Mohawks, and that would be fine, just because we this is there's no land ownership. There's just communities that wanted to help each other. Later archaeology, like the newest archaeology that are being taken, that are coming up in sites around Manhattan area, or even still in Quebec, they're done now at least with some care and perspective, and you're having these new findings. You're seeing someone that was buried, that's Haudenosaunee, buried to some other community, and the archaeologists are coming with them with a better perspective that we knew would be the right perspective, is that they're not seeing a Haudenosaunee community coming in and wiping out a village. They're seeing a Haudenosaunee community coming in and marrying in, and the influence merging with that community, because you're seeing two people buried next to each other, and you're seeing artifacts from Haudenosaunee communities, and you're seeing another community with their artifacts, but these are husband and wife. You're seeing these are families that are buried together. This is not like a hostile takeover. We're not seeing the Mohawks just take over the east part of New York State. You're seeing that through Mohawks and our ideas, we're winning out, and it's changing the minds and hearts of the communities, and they kind of adopt these things. So a lot of our what we try to tell our teach is that we, of course, there was probably conflicts. We're not going to say we're completely peaceful people, but the over exaggeration is that misunderstanding that we always try to attack first, because it paints us as savages, and that's going back to who does that serve, where follow the money. But predominantly our ideas won out more than we had to fight. Our community wanted to do the best that we could, so any kind of update to a technique would then be pretty much just like a software patch. And then when that community would reach out to another community in our extensive trade route, they would see that, and then that upgrade would be patched into every person we traded with. So ideas won more battles than actual physical conflicts. And again, our trade network, how is something that doesn't get talked enough, because it's that counter narrative that's saying that we weren't using the land. Manifest destiny, that we need to come in and take it from the savages because they're not using the land right, when in fact we had very complex and widespread networks between other communities, from far as down as North Carolina, because we'd have tobacco come up, and we would be trading furs even before the French came here, and they would come down and the furs would move there. We got our wampum from areas around Manhattan to do our wampum belts. So you're seeing this exhaustive trade network go vast areas pre-contact even. So I know that's one place where we want to talk to, is that we were again, bustling communities that were in contact, were in balance. And yes, there was always going to be, it's human nature to have you know, um, you know, conflict, but at the same time, it was just again, to our in the way as our teachings, over exaggerated, because especially when we started forming the Haudenosaunee, those were these wampum belts. Why they mean so much to us is once we present that to another community, that's meaning you're joining our family. It's you are now not just agreeing to a treaty, you're agreeing to a lifestyle that we will protect each other to the end. And those were lifelong agreements, I mean, for everyone. So these meant so much to us. It wasn't about the bead value, it was about the value of our our values, our ethics were tied into that. It's who we were was saying that once you say yes to this, we are now one. And so that is so important that we try to tell people, because again, going back to the offhanded comments we get a lot, warring savages, it's once we have to start there, it takes a long time for me to get to where, I just talked about how we were more in balance, and that like we weren't nomadic. We just knew that once the environment we were in was getting taxed, we moved on so that, the environment would be able to heal itself. And then maybe in a generation or two come back, the fish population would rebound. The plentifulness of the nutrients in the earth would be good again. I mean, it goes to our three sisters, or in the way we plant is that again, those three plants work together because they take out different nutrients and they put back the ones that are good taken from the other ones, so you can get longer usage out of the pill that way. And so, and even for me, 2 years to working here, I'm finding out how cool some of our early technology was. Like we had like waterproof shoes, so it's like I didn't know that. And like this, all the cool things we were doing before contact was like, even for me, was kept away from me for 40 years until I really was able to spend more time talking to other community members and hearing their stories and seeing how, you know, um, just so complicated and so, interesting my ancestors were. And it's such an enlightening thing that I get to now sit here and try to help that and help communicate, all these amazing things that uh, are just for me so invigorating, because of like getting told your entire life that, you know kill the Indian, save the man, that, well, you guys don't matter, you guys lost, it's our land now. And this, whole you're growing up your whole life hearing all these negative things. It's just great to find that native joy, that indigenous joy in like our own culture. Just it's taken me 40 years to get here though. So it's, and again, I'm not an anomaly. There's a lot of our community members that we're getting to it, and it is one of the things that like motivate me is to help do things like this to help, communicate that, as not only are we still here, but like look at the things that we contribute to the world before and then after contact. It's just interesting to see and there's so much more that I need to discover, but at the same time, there's so much more to the Haudenosaunee or the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk people of Flint did, and how, I think beautiful their, are, the thing I come from. And, again, one of the old stories we have too about when we come to our grand councils, when after the Haudenosaunee was formed, some of the ideas on how to have, strong communication is that you'd go out and then you travel all the way to Onondaga, the Keepers of the Flame. So all the communities are coming out to the central location. Then you would play this big game of lacrosse. You get tired out, then have a big meal, and then you get fed. And then you'd go into, the big discussions, like why you were all called there, because each community had a couple chiefs that would go represent, because again, my community is Akwesasne, but then like our, the community that kind of helped formed us was Ganawage, that's next to Montreal. They would send a couple chiefs, and then where they would all go as representative democracy to the ground council and bring their issues. And so again, having that, traveling that far away, having a big lacrosse game, then having a big meal, you're really tiring out the body, and then you're nourishing the body, and then you're hopefully coming with a good mind to those discussions. So a lot of the aggressions worked out, a lot of the frustration is worked out after you're not hangry anymore. So again, Snickers got it right. That's what we learned too, is like if you feed somebody, like a lot of that hangriness goes down. So it's coming to that table with a thoughtful and a community forward mindset. You're on
And
mute.
oh yeah, Ramin, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Justin. I just want to uplift a couple of things that you're saying, because as you're talking, here's what occurred to me, right? The Europeans, the colonizers who came to this part of the world, and as I said, it's about following the money. What's the reason to downplay the humanity and the sophistication of the tribal people who were found here? And we know what the reason was. But as you were talking, something occurred to me. So you were talking about movement and technology and the sharing of technology. And I start to think about the Silk Road, right? The ancient Silk routes out of China and India and North Africa, many, many routes that went up into Europe. And then they also encompassed the sea and so on. And then I started to think about Druid communities and Zoroastrian communities and Buddhist communities. And the reason I'm bringing this up is to say that I believe, I would venture that at least some percentage of Europeans, at least the ones in the administration, certainly knew what they were seeing on some level, right? There was this deep ignorance without a doubt, but people creating technologies, adopting it from each other, moving for resources to protect the land. On some, throughout human history and the quote unquote old world, this is recognizable behavior, right? So again, I say to you, that makes me ask, what was the reason to refuse to acknowledge what was right in front of you that there is some basis of understanding for, right? And we know why, right? But I think that's really important when we think about these questions, to really try to task ourselves with what was within the realm of them to understand and recognize, what wasn't, and what's the motivation at every turn, to refuse to even recognize things that are recognizable, even if the details of them are not understood.
Yeah, I think we're gonna get like way more into that in our non-recorded portion. So because I really want folks to like share what they have experienced in the way of like thinking about it like that. Um, I think to sort of just like close out this part of our conversation, I would love to hear from both of you about how can we understand the differences between Eurocentric and Indigenous perspectives? And then how can we use that understanding to better inform place-based commemorations? So like, how do we make sense of these differences? And then what can those differences, understanding those differences do for us when we're trying to do our like hyper local commemoration?
Well, for us, what we always think about is that the first step to understanding the difference is to understand that whether we track it or not, almost every single thing we understand about the places in which we live is from a Eurocentric point of view now, right? That's what we're all raised up to. That's what we all understand. Even while, like, I always marvel about this, right? Even here in Connecticut, certainly in New York State, the indigenous place names that surround us are vast. And we have been taught not to track that, to understand, right? That in here in Westport, there's a section of the town called Saugatuck. That's a native word, right? We have, many such examples, but yet I think, so to understand the difference between these two perspectives is to first acknowledge that even when we think we're not doing it, we're doing it. We're looking at it from a Eurocentric point of view because that is what we have been informed, right? And because of what Justin has said, the silencing of tribal communities, there hasn't been a balance up to now. So if you go into it understanding that there's no balance, right? There isn't. So you have to work harder to find that balance and find the information that's been denied, all of us really, right? And therefore we've all been robbed of this amazing cultural detail. I think we have to come to it like that. We have to come to it understanding that we really don't, that we have been sort of deliberately denied this information. And even when we think we know, we don't know, right? That's kind of my philosophy in life. Assume you don't know anything and, therefore you can learn. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and just that last piece, I'm like, yeah, and there's so much that comes from my own insecurities my entire life, not having access to, my language and not having access to like a grandfather that could tell me stories about growing up on like the St. Lawrence and knowing all the pathways and knowing all the actual Mohawk names for all the rivers and streams. And, so it's like those things always bring, always brought a duality to me of like struggling for like years. And at least now I could put some of those anxieties to bed as I learn more, because in talking to community members, I grew up on St. Regis, which is a peninsula that is 80% New York State, 20% Quebec. Wait, I did the math right there. Okay. And St. Regis is because that's where they put the church, and where they put the church was one of the most predominant places in Akwesasne. And it used to be called Akwesasne, that portion of Akwesasne, and that river right there wasn't St. Regis River, it was Akwesasne. So kind of just tying it back to some of these things is that our riverways, are so important to us. And that, like, now when I drive my son to like hockey or lacrosse, and we get to St. Regis Falls, I'm like, I'd nudge him and be like, that's Akwesasne Falls if we were doing it the right way. And so it just kind of, there's a little, yeah, definitely, decolonizing there. But going back to our point of view is that I'm going to try to do this because I'm learning myself. And it's one thing is like, don't, all the Mohawk teachers that are teaching me like the Mohawk words are like, just say it, you'll get used to it, and eventually it'll come out right. And yeah, again, I'm like, Onda Dekwa, Galio Wadekwa are the words that come before all else. It's our Thanksgiving address. That's where our perspective is that we think everything. We think, the winds, the medicines, the grass, the food, the plants, the animals, the good weather, the bad weather. We thank everything. We go through the whole thing and thank the Creator for what they gave us and thank everything. So our perspective is that we're a part of all this, and we kind of put ourselves at the end of all that just because we're not here if everything else is not here. And so that's where, even before there was a climate and change and like, contact, is that our mindset came from the beginning of like living in a balance, because it could be gone. And even that early perspective to our people is like, that's why that is said before every now in our communities. It's said before conferences, it's said before big meetings, it's said before the small meetings in like the Mohawk schools. And I say schools because on the U.S. portion, we have the Mohawk School, that's a state school, but on SNY is also split between the United States and Canada, and that's portion of the Quebec has, um, and, considered a Mohawk school, but it's the Canadian one in Jishnaina, and they do that instead of the Pledge of Allegiance. Same thing with Ganondago, they do that. That's in Ontario, but then it's still, it's in the Quebec portion of St. Regis, so it's like they do that instead. And like, so, and Goanoge is the Ontario portion, and they also do that. So they have 3 little smaller elementary schools that's what they do instead of, well, again, they're on the Canadian side, so they don't do Pledge of Allegiance, but we kind of do that instead, because that's like, again, putting our mindset is that, we're trying to thank everything for allowing us to be here. So again, that's where we center ourselves, is that we give thanks.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for this. Leah, I think we're good to stop our recording, and I'm going to ask